Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The smile felt different. What would hurt you more, finding out your husband lost his job, or realizing he looked into your eyes every single day and decided not to tell you? I never imagined that one ordinary Tuesday in the United States would quietly become the beginning of the biggest emotional test of our marriage. If you've ever felt something was wrong but couldn't explain why, stay with me. This isn't just a love story. It's a story about trust, silent fear, family, and how one simple English phrase helped me understand what my heart already knew long before my mind did. I always believed I knew my husband better than anyone else. After years of marriage, I could usually tell whether he was tired, excited, stressed, or simply pretending everything was fine. We lived a peaceful life in a quiet American neighborhood. Our mornings began with coffee, quick breakfasts, and reminding our children not to forget their backpacks. Evenings were filled with simple conversations, homework, cooking dinner together, and watching the sunset from our backyard whenever the weather was kind enough to let us. Nothing about our life looked unusual. That was exactly why I almost missed the biggest secret he had ever kept from me. One Tuesday afternoon, he walked through the front door at exactly 5:32 p.m., smiled warmly, kissed my forehead, and asked, "How was your day?" I answered automatically, but something deep inside me whispered, that smile isn't real. It wasn't smaller. It wasn't forced. It simply didn't reach his eyes. Have you ever noticed that? Sometimes people smile with their mouths while their eyes quietly tell another story. That evening, while practicing English, I wrote a new expression in my notebook, "Something doesn't feel right." It's a simple sentence, but native speakers often use it when they sense a problem without having proof. I repeated it several times to improve my pronunciation. I had no idea I was also describing my own marriage. During the following days, tiny details started collecting inside my memory. My husband no longer shared funny stories from work. His phone stopped ringing during dinner. He checked the time more often than usual. Once, I accidentally walked into the living room and saw him quickly close his laptop before I could see the screen. He smiled again and asked if I wanted ice cream. It felt strangely sweet, almost like he wanted to distract me. At first, I blamed myself. Modern psychology says our brains are excellent at spotting patterns, even when nothing dangerous is happening. Sometimes anxiety creates stories that aren't true. I told myself I was simply overthinking. After all, life in America moves fast. People become tired. Stress comes and goes. Not every quiet moment hides a disaster. That's what I wanted to believe. Then Saturday arrived. We visited a local farmer's market filled with fresh fruit, homemade bread, live music, and families laughing together. It should have been a perfect afternoon. My husband bought me fresh sunflowers for no reason. He held my hand almost the entire time. He even suggested taking more family photos than usual. Most wives would probably call that romantic. Instead, a strange question kept repeating in my head. Why was he acting like someone trying to preserve happy memories? That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was completely silent except for the soft sound of the refrigerator. As I passed the dining table, I noticed my husband's laptop was still open. I wasn't trying to read anything private. I only wanted to close it before the battery died. But just as I reached for the screen, one notification appeared for only a second before everything locked automatically. I only caught a few words. Yet those few words made my heart pound harder than it ever had before, because they began with, regarding the termination of your employment. And in that frozen moment, I realized my husband hadn't been coming home from work at all. Small clues everywhere. I wanted to believe I had misunderstood what I saw on that laptop. Maybe the message belonged to someone else. Maybe the word termination meant something completely different. But deep inside, another question refused to disappear. If my husband had really lost his job, where had he been going every morning? The answer was waiting for me, hidden inside the smallest details that I had ignored for weeks, and once I started connecting them, I wished I had never looked. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the notification flashed across my mind again, regarding the termination of your employment. It was only a few words, yet they echoed louder than any argument we had ever had. The next morning, my husband woke up before sunrise, just as he always did. He ironed his shirt, packed his lunch bag, poured coffee into his travel mug, kissed me on the forehead, and softly said, "See you tonight." Everything looked perfectly normal. But for the first time, I noticed something strange. His company ID badge wasn't hanging around his neck anymore. I couldn't remember exactly when it had disappeared. Had it been gone for days? Or even weeks? My stomach tightened. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It quietly introduces itself through tiny missing pieces. While practicing my English later that morning, I wrote another useful expression in my notebook: something isn't adding up. Native speakers use it when the facts don't make sense together. I whispered the sentence several times, never imagining how perfectly it described my life. That afternoon, I decided not to call my husband like I usually did. Instead, I waited. No messages arrived. No quick "busy today" text. Nothing. Around lunchtime, I checked our shared banking app to make sure I had enough money for groceries. One deposit I expected to see wasn't there. I refreshed the screen twice. Then 3 times. Maybe payroll was delayed, I told myself. Companies change payment schedules sometimes. I wanted a reasonable explanation because the unreasonable one terrified me. Later, while folding laundry, I found a folded piece of paper inside one of his jacket pockets. It wasn't a love letter or a receipt. It was a printed list of interview questions. Tell me about yourself. Why do you want to work here? What are your greatest strengths? My hands started shaking. These weren't random notes. Someone preparing for interviews carries hope and fear at the same time. But why hadn't he told me? Why was he carrying this burden alone? Psychology researchers often explain that people under intense stress sometimes hide painful experiences from those they love. Believing silence protects their family from worry. It sounds noble, but silence rarely protects anyone. More often, it builds invisible walls inside relationships. That evening, my husband came home smiling again. He even brought my favorite blueberry muffins from a local bakery. He hugged our children a little longer than usual and laughed louder than I had heard in weeks. The performance was almost perfect. Almost. Because every few minutes, he glanced toward the front window, as if he expected someone to knock on the door. After dinner, he carried the trash outside. I watched from the kitchen window. Instead of walking straight back, he stood alone beside the driveway, staring into the dark sky with both hands covering his face. He thought no one could see him. For nearly a minute, he didn't move. Then he took one deep breath, wiped his eyes, forced another smile onto his face, and walked back inside like nothing had happened. I said nothing. But in that moment, I made a decision. The next morning, after he left for work, I was going to follow him. Because I needed to know where my husband was really going every single day. The truth finally came out. I never thought I would follow my own husband. It sounded like something from a movie, not something a wife happily married in the United States would ever do. But when trust starts whispering and silence starts shouting, curiosity becomes impossible to ignore. I told myself I only wanted proof that I was wrong. Instead, I found a truth so heartbreaking that, for a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. The next morning began like every other weekday. My husband smiled, picked up his travel mug, grabbed his lunch bag, and left the house with a cheerful, "See you tonight." I waited exactly 3 minutes before quietly getting into my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I wasn't angry anymore. I was frightened. Part of me prayed he would drive straight to his office so I could laugh at myself for imagining the worst. Instead, I watched his car pass the exit toward his workplace without slowing down. My heart dropped. He continued driving across town until he reached a large public park. It was just after 8 in the morning. Joggers were exercising. Dog owners were chatting. Parents pushed strollers under tall green trees. My husband parked near a quiet bench, turned off the engine, and simply sat there. For nearly 2 hours, he never left the driver's seat. He wasn't working. He wasn't meeting anyone. He just stared through the windshield as if he had nowhere else to go. I had never seen loneliness look so heavy. While sitting in my own car several spaces away, I remembered another useful English expression, face the truth. It means accepting reality, even when it hurts. I whispered the sentence slowly to practice my pronunciation. But it felt less like an English lesson and more like a message my own heart needed to hear. Around 10 o'clock, my husband finally stepped out of the car. He walked to a nearby coffee shop, ordered the smallest cup of coffee, opened his laptop, and began sending resumes. I could see his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Every few minutes, he checked his email with the hopeful look of someone waiting for a miracle. Then his shoulders slowly dropped again. No replies. No interviews. No good news. Suddenly, everything made sense. The missing paycheck. The interview questions hidden inside his jacket. The forced smiles. The flowers. The extra family photos. He wasn't preparing for a better future. He was desperately trying to protect the one we already had. I drove home before he noticed me. My mind replayed every conversation we had shared during the past few weeks. Had he been pretending every single day? Or had he wanted to tell me but simply couldn't find the courage? Psychologists often explain that many people connect their self-worth to their careers. Losing a job can feel like losing part of their identity. Instead of asking for help, they hide their pain because they fear disappointing the people they love most. For the first time, I stopped thinking like an angry wife and started thinking like a partner. That evening, when he walked through the front door, he smiled exactly the same way he always had. But this time, I could see the exhaustion hiding behind his eyes. During dinner, our children laughed about school while he laughed with them, pretending everything was normal. I watched him carefully, wondering how someone could carry so much fear without letting it spill onto the people around him. After the dishes were washed and the house became quiet, he walked upstairs to take a shower. His phone remained on the kitchen counter beside me. A new email notification suddenly lit up the screen. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. But one subject line appeared before the screen faded to black, and those 6 words changed everything. We regret to inform you. Fear inside our home. The email began with 6 polite words that no family ever wants to read. We regret to inform you. I froze. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. I already knew another job application had been rejected. Suddenly, the strongest man I knew no longer looked like a husband hiding a secret. He looked like someone silently losing a battle every single day while trying to protect the people he loved. But what happened just a few minutes later shattered my heart even more than that email ever could. I quietly placed his phone exactly where it had been before the screen turned black. My hands were trembling, but my mind was strangely calm. I wasn't searching for more evidence anymore. The truth had already found me. Upstairs, I could hear the shower running. Downstairs, our home looked exactly the same as always. The family photos still covered the walls. Our children's backpacks waited by the front door. Dinner dishes were drying beside the sink. Everything looked normal, yet nothing felt normal anymore. I suddenly understood how fear could live inside a beautiful house without making a sound. While waiting for him to come downstairs, I opened my English notebook and wrote another useful expression. Carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Native speakers use this phrase when someone feels responsible for every problem around them. I whispered it slowly, repeating each word. Then I closed the notebook because I realized those words perfectly described my husband. He wasn't only looking for a new job. He was carrying our future alone because he believed that was what a husband was supposed to do. Modern psychologists often explain that chronic stress changes the way people think. Instead of asking for support, many begin believing they must solve every problem by themselves. The longer they stay silent, the heavier that invisible burden becomes. Looking back, I could finally understand why he had been smiling so often. It wasn't happiness. It was armor. Later that evening, our son asked if we could still go camping during the school break. My husband answered immediately. Of course, he said with a bright smile. We'll have a great time. I looked at him across the table. We both knew he had no idea whether we could afford that trip anymore. Yet he refused to let disappointment reach our children. After dinner, I noticed him sitting alone in the backyard. The sun had almost disappeared, leaving only soft orange light across the sky. I watched from the kitchen window as he stared at the grass without moving. For the first time in our marriage, he looked defeated. Not weak. Not broken. Just exhausted from pretending everything was okay. I wanted to walk outside, wrap my arms around him, and tell him I already knew everything. But another part of me hesitated. If I confronted him too soon, would he feel embarrassed? Would he think I had betrayed his privacy? Or would he finally feel relieved? There was no perfect answer. Sometimes love isn't about saying the right words. It's about choosing the right moment. Before going to bed, he smiled again and quietly said, "Everything will be okay." I smiled back because I knew he needed to believe those words, even if he couldn't prove them. But after he fell asleep, I stayed awake staring at the ceiling. My mind wasn't thinking about money anymore. It was thinking about trust. Marriage isn't tested when life is easy. It's tested when two people are standing in the same storm but pretending the rain isn't falling. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for another clue, another email, or another painful smile. I was going to ask him one simple question over breakfast. And I had no idea that his answer would begin with 4 words I never expected to hear. I was afraid. One honest conversation. Have you ever prepared yourself for the worst conversation of your life, only to discover that the other person had been hurting even more than you? I thought I was about to confront my husband with a painful secret. Instead, I watched the strongest man in my family finally run out of strength. What he confessed over breakfast changed the way I understood love forever, and one simple English sentence became the turning point of our marriage. The next morning felt unusually quiet. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, the coffee maker hummed softly, and our children had already left for school. It looked like an ordinary American weekday, but my heart was beating so hard that I could barely hold my coffee mug. My husband sat across from me, reading headlines on his phone as if everything were completely normal. I looked into his eyes and gently asked, "Can we talk before you leave?" He slowly lowered the phone onto the table. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I quietly said, "You don't have to pretend anymore. I know you lost your job." His face turned pale. The color disappeared so quickly that it frightened me. He didn't deny it. He didn't make excuses. He simply looked down at his hands. After what felt like an entire minute, he whispered 4 words that broke my heart. "I was afraid, Emily." His voice cracked before he could continue. Tears filled his eyes, but he kept trying to smile anyway. "I wasn't afraid of finding another job," he said. "I was afraid of disappointing you." At that moment, every suspicion, every sleepless night, and every unanswered question suddenly made sense. He hadn't been protecting his pride. He had been trying to protect my peace. While listening, I remembered another useful English expression that native speakers often use: "We're in this together." It means facing difficulties as a team instead of fighting alone. I quietly repeated the sentence in my mind because I realized those 4 words were exactly what my husband needed to hear. Research in relationship psychology shows that couples who openly share stress usually recover from difficult situations more successfully than couples who hide their worries. Silence often feels like protection, but honesty creates connection. Looking at my husband, I understood that fear had convinced him to carry everything by himself. He told me he had been parking near a public park every morning because he couldn't bear coming home and admitting he had nowhere to go. He spent hours applying for jobs from coffee shops, libraries, and even his car. Every rejection email made him smile a little harder at home because he didn't want our children to notice anything was wrong. "I thought if I found another job quickly," he whispered, "you would never have to know." I reached across the table and held his hand. "I don't need a perfect husband," I told him softly. "I need an honest partner." For the first time in weeks, he cried without trying to hide it. We sat there together in complete silence, and strangely, that silence felt healthier than all the cheerful conversations we had shared while pretending everything was fine. Then he looked at me with red eyes and gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "There's something else I haven't told you," he said. My heart skipped a beat. I thought losing his job had been the biggest secret. I was wrong. He slowly reached into his backpack, pulled out a sealed envelope, and placed it on the kitchen table between us. Without saying another word, he pushed it toward me. Across the front, I saw the logo of another company. And the words, "Final Interview Invitation." Starting again together. That envelope looked like hope. Until I noticed my husband's hands were shaking so badly that he could barely let go of it. One final interview could save everything, or become one more painful rejection. I thought the hardest part of our story was already behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. What happened during the next 48 hours taught me that love isn't measured by how many problems you solve, but by who stays beside you while you're solving them. I slowly opened the envelope and read every word twice. It was real. A respected company just outside our city had invited my husband to a final interview. My first reaction was excitement, but it lasted only a few seconds. Then I looked at him. Instead of smiling, he stared at the kitchen table as though he expected bad news to appear from nowhere. "What's wrong?" I asked quietly. He sighed and admitted, "I've reached the final interview 3 times already. Every time they chose someone else." My heart sank. Suddenly I understood why he hadn't celebrated this invitation. Hope had become dangerous for him. Every time he allowed himself to believe, disappointment followed. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Then we'll prepare differently this time," I said. "Not because you're not good enough, but because you won't be alone anymore." He looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time in weeks, the smile on his face reached his eyes. That afternoon, our dining room transformed into a practice room. I searched for common interview questions while he answered them aloud. Since I enjoy improving my English every day, I suggested we practice exactly as the interview would happen. One expression quickly became our favorite: "I'm excited about this opportunity." Native speakers often use this sentence to sound confident, positive, and professional. We repeated it together until it sounded completely natural. Every answer became smoother. Every practice session made him stand a little taller. Research in psychology suggests that rehearsing stressful situations can reduce anxiety because the brain slowly begins treating unfamiliar experiences as familiar ones. Watching my husband practice reminded me that confidence isn't something people are born with. It's something they quietly build, one small success at a time. The following morning, before the interview, our children surprised him by leaving handwritten notes beside his coffee mug. One said, "Good luck, Dad." Another simply read, "We believe in you." He smiled, but this time there were tears in his eyes instead of fear. As he walked toward the front door, he turned around unexpectedly and hugged me longer than usual. "Thank you," he whispered, "for finding the truth before I lost myself." After he drove away, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I cleaned the kitchen twice. I folded already folded towels. I checked the clock every few minutes. Hours felt like days. Finally, my phone buzzed. My heart raced as I saw his name on the screen. I answered immediately, expecting either laughter or silence. Instead, I heard his voice trembling. "The interview is over," he said. He paused for several seconds. I could hear traffic in the background and the sound of a deep breath. They asked me one question I never expected. Before I could respond, the call suddenly disconnected. I stared at my phone in complete confusion. I called him back once. No answer. Twice. Straight to voicemail. Then a new text message appeared. It contained only 5 words: "Something happened after I left." Lessons from American life. My husband's phone went silent after one terrifying text: "Something happened after I left." For nearly 30 minutes, I imagined every possible disaster. Had he been rejected again? Had he been in an accident? Or had something even stranger happened after the interview? When he finally called back, his first sentence wasn't about the job. It was about a man he had unexpectedly met in the parking lot, a 5-minute conversation that would quietly change our family's future. I stood in the kitchen staring at my phone, trying not to panic. Every passing minute felt longer than the last. Then it rang. I answered before the second vibration. "Are you okay?" I asked almost without taking a breath. My husband laughed softly. It wasn't the nervous laugh I had heard so many times before. It sounded calmer, almost surprised. "I'm okay," he said. But something happened after the interview that I never saw coming. He explained that as he walked toward his car, an older gentleman called his name. At first, my husband thought he had forgotten some paperwork inside the building. Instead, the man introduced himself as a senior manager who had quietly observed part of the interview. "You answered every question honestly," the manager had told him. "Most people try to sound perfect. You sounded real." Those words stayed with me long after my husband repeated them. In today's world, people often believe they must hide every weakness to succeed. Yet sometimes honesty becomes the strongest qualification of all. While listening, I opened my English notebook and wrote another expression, "Be yourself." It's one of the simplest phrases in English, yet perhaps one of the hardest to live by. Native speakers use it as encouragement, reminding someone that authenticity often leaves a stronger impression than perfection. My husband continued telling me the story. The manager admitted there were many qualified candidates, but one answer had stood out. When asked about overcoming failure, my husband didn't invent an impressive story. He simply admitted he had recently experienced a difficult professional setback and had learned that asking for help was not a sign of weakness. He never mentioned losing his previous job directly, but he spoke honestly about resilience, family, and choosing hope over pride. Ironically, the secret he had hidden from us became the lesson that impressed the interviewer the most. Psychology researchers frequently describe vulnerability as something that strengthens trust rather than weakens it. When people share genuine struggles appropriately, listeners often perceive them as more trustworthy and emotionally intelligent. Watching my husband slowly rediscover his confidence reminded me that resilience isn't pretending life is easy. It's continuing even after life proves it isn't. That evening, we sat on our back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. A cool breeze carried the familiar sounds of children playing nearby and neighbors walking their dogs. Life around us hadn't changed. Yet somehow everything felt different. For the first time in weeks, my husband wasn't pretending to be okay. He actually was okay. Not because he already had a new job, but because he no longer carried his fears alone. "Do you know what I learned?" he asked quietly. I smiled. "Tell me." He looked toward the fading sky and said, "Losing my job wasn't the worst thing that happened to me. Believing I had to hide it from the people who loved me was." I reached for his hand, and neither of us spoke for a while. Then, just as we were about to go inside, his phone buzzed again. We looked at the screen together. The email wasn't from the company where he had interviewed that morning. It came from somewhere completely unexpected, and the subject line contained 7 words that instantly made both of us stop breathing. "An opportunity we'd like to discuss." A door opened unexpectedly. One unexpected email. 7 simple words. That was all it took to turn one of the darkest weeks of our marriage into something neither of us could have predicted. But here's the strange part, it wasn't a job offer. It wasn't even from the company my husband had interviewed with. It came from someone we had almost forgotten, proving that one kind conversation can quietly return months later and completely rewrite your future. My husband and I stared at the email without saying a word. The sender's name didn't belong to a recruiter we recognized. Instead, it was someone he had met at a local community business event almost 6 months earlier. At the time, they had exchanged business cards, talked for less than 10 minutes, and never contacted each other again. My husband almost deleted the message because he assumed it was another advertisement. Thankfully, he opened it first. The email read, "Your name came up during a hiring discussion today. We'd like to talk if you're available this week." We looked at each other in complete disbelief. Neither of us knew whether to laugh or cry. Life has a strange way of rewarding moments you barely remember. Sometimes the seeds you plant with simple kindness grow long after you've forgotten where you planted them. While my husband reread the email, I opened my English notebook and wrote another useful expression, "You never know." Native English speakers use this phrase when reminding someone that surprising opportunities can appear at any time. I smiled because those 3 words perfectly described our lives. Just 2 weeks earlier, we believed our future was falling apart. Now, hope was knocking on our front door from a direction we had never expected. The following afternoon, my husband joined a video meeting with the company's hiring director. I stayed in the living room, pretending to read a magazine while secretly listening for changes in his voice. At first, the conversation sounded formal. Then I heard laughter. A few minutes later, I heard even more laughter. That sound alone made me breathe easier than I had in weeks. Psychologists often explain that optimism isn't pretending everything will be fine. Real optimism grows after people survive uncertainty and realize they are stronger than they imagined. Looking back, I understood exactly what they meant. My husband no longer sounded desperate. He sounded confident because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply being himself. Nearly an hour later, he walked out of the room with the biggest genuine smile I had seen in months. Before saying anything, he wrapped both arms around me so tightly I could hardly breathe. "No matter what happens," he whispered, "thank you for not giving up on me." Tears filled my eyes before I could answer. Sometimes the greatest victory arrives before the final result. It arrives the moment someone believes in themselves again. That evening, we celebrated with homemade burgers, lemonade, and a family movie night. Our children had no idea how close we had come to losing hope. Watching them laugh together reminded me why every difficult conversation had been worth having. Just before bedtime, my husband's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed the company where he had completed the final interview earlier that week. He looked at me nervously before answering. I couldn't hear the other voice, but I watched his expression slowly change from surprise to disbelief to quiet tears. He thanked the caller several times before ending the conversation. Then he turned toward me, holding the phone so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He smiled through tears and whispered, "You're not going to believe this. They didn't just offer me the job." Stronger than before. When my husband whispered, "They didn't just offer me the job," my heart stopped again. I thought I already knew the ending of our story. I was wrong. What the hiring manager said next made us both cry in the middle of our kitchen. Sometimes life doesn't simply give you another chance. It gives you proof that your worst chapter was never meant to become your final one. But the biggest surprise was still waiting for us. For a few long seconds, I couldn't speak. My husband stood in front of me with tears in his eyes, still holding his phone as if he were afraid the call had only been a dream. "What do you mean?" I finally whispered. He laughed, shook his head, and wiped his eyes. "They offered me the position." He paused, letting the words settle. "But they also offered me a higher salary than I asked for." I stared at him in complete disbelief. After weeks of rejection emails, silent mornings, and hidden pain, this moment felt almost unreal. According to the hiring manager, the interview panel believed my husband showed something more valuable than a perfect resume. He showed resilience, honesty, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. One interviewer even said, "Skills can be taught. Character is much harder to find." Those words stayed with both of us long after the phone call ended. While making dinner that evening, I opened my English notebook and wrote another expression that perfectly matched the moment. Everything happens for a reason. Many native English speakers use this phrase to comfort themselves after difficult experiences. Whether it's always true or not, I understood why people say it. If my husband had never lost his previous job, he would never have searched for this opportunity. If he had never struggled, he might never have answered the interview questions with such honesty. Research in positive psychology suggests that people often discover new strengths after overcoming adversity. Experts call this post-traumatic growth, the idea that difficult experiences can sometimes lead to greater confidence, stronger relationships, and a clearer sense of purpose. Looking at my husband, I realized I wasn't simply seeing someone who had found a better job. I was seeing someone who had found himself again. That weekend, our family celebrated with a picnic at a beautiful local park. The children laughed while chasing each other across the grass, completely unaware of how close our family had come to a very different future. My husband looked more relaxed than he had in months. His smile no longer looked practiced. It looked peaceful. As we sat together watching the sunset, he quietly turned to me and said, "If I ever face something like this again, I promise you won't hear about it from an email or a notification." I smiled and squeezed his hand. "And I promise you," I replied, "you'll never have to carry that weight alone again." We both laughed softly because those promises sounded simple, yet they had been earned through one of the hardest seasons of our marriage. Just when we believed the storm had finally passed, my husband reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "There's one more thing," he said with an excited grin. I unfolded it slowly. It wasn't another job offer. It wasn't another interview invitation. It was a handwritten note from the senior manager he had met after the interview, and the final sentence made my eyes fill with tears all over again. "I think your story will inspire more people than you realize. Love never lost its job." If you've listened this far, let me ask you one question. What if the worst day of your life wasn't sent to destroy your future, but to reveal who would stand beside you when everything else disappeared? My husband thought losing his job would make him lose my respect. Instead, it reminded both of us that careers can change overnight, but real love survives the conversations people are most afraid to have. And the final surprise in our story came months later, when we least expected it. Several months passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Every weekday morning, my husband left for work again, but this time the smile on his face wasn't something he forced. It was quiet, relaxed, and completely real. Our children noticed the difference before I did. One evening, our daughter smiled and said, "Dad laughs a lot more now." We looked at each other across the dinner table without saying a word. She was right. We hadn't simply survived a difficult season. We had become a stronger family because of it. Looking back, I realized the biggest problem had never been unemployment. The real danger was believing that love had to be protected by silence. It doesn't. Love grows stronger when truth finally has room to breathe. That experience also changed the way I practiced English every day. Instead of memorizing complicated vocabulary, I focused on simple expressions that carried real emotions. My favorite became "we'll get through this." Native English speakers often say this during difficult times to remind each other that problems are temporary when people face them together. I repeated those words many times, and eventually they became more than an English lesson. They became part of our family's story. Relationship researchers often explain that couples who recover from major setbacks usually share one important habit. They stop seeing each other as opponents and start seeing the problem as the opponent instead. That idea completely changed my perspective. My husband wasn't hiding because he didn't trust me. He was hiding because fear had convinced him that protecting us meant suffering alone. Once fear disappeared, honesty finally had space to grow. One Sunday afternoon, while cleaning a bookshelf, I found the old notebook where I had written the sentence, "Something doesn't feel right." I smiled as I turned the pages. Every English phrase I had practiced during those difficult weeks now reminded me of a different step in our journey. Face the truth. We're in this together. Be yourself. You never know. Those weren't just useful expressions anymore. They had quietly become chapters of our marriage. Then something unexpected happened. My husband came home carrying a small envelope. "Remember the senior manager?" he asked. I nodded. Inside the envelope was a handwritten thank you card. He had written that my husband's honesty during the interview had inspired the company to start discussing better employee wellness and mental health. Support. One conversation, born from one painful secret, had encouraged people we would probably never meet. I felt tears forming again because I finally understood the note he had given us months earlier. Our story had traveled further than our family. Maybe someone else would decide not to hide their struggles anymore. Maybe another husband or wife would choose one honest conversation instead of weeks of silent fear. If that happened, every difficult day we endured would have been worth it. Before going to bed that night, my husband smiled and asked, "If this happened again, what would you do?" I laughed softly and answered, "I'd make you tell me on the very first day." He laughed too, and this time there were no secrets hiding behind his smile. Only peace, gratitude, and hope for tomorrow. If this story reminded you that even the hardest seasons can become the beginning of something better, remember this. A job can be lost in one afternoon, but trust can be rebuilt one honest conversation at a time. And sometimes, that's the greatest success anyone could ever achieve. Before you leave, let me ask you one final question. How many people are smiling today while silently carrying a burden no one else can see? Maybe someone in your family. Maybe a friend. Maybe even you. If this story reminded you that honesty is stronger than fear, then its purpose was fulfilled. And while you practiced your English today, I hope you also discovered something even more valuable, that every difficult season can become the beginning of a better chapter. If you enjoyed this slow English story, don't stop here. On this channel, you'll find more emotional stories about love, marriage, family, American life, and everyday conversations, all told in slow, clear English to help you improve your listening, vocabulary, pronunciation, and speaking naturally. The next story waiting for you may surprise you even more than this one. It begins with one ordinary moment and ends with a secret no one saw coming. Click on the next video now before you leave. You might discover your new favorite English story. If this video touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and which part of the story moved you the most. Every comment inspires me to create more meaningful stories for English learners around the world. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until our next story. Keep listening. Keep learning. Keep believing. Because sometimes, the sentence that changes your English is also the story that changes your life.